Now that Dana White has finally announced the fight for the vacant heavyweight title at UFC 285, he's still throwing jabs at Francis Ngannou. So what's the deal? Apparently, the UFC couldn't come to terms with Francis. So I know the UFC's a pretty big deal, and the prestige that comes with being a UFC fighter is insane. But would you really stick around for a job that pays you chump change? Don't get me wrong, these fighters do take home big paychecks. But considering how so many of them are leaving, I'm not so sure if the entire gig pays that well. And after that whole botched leak from T-Mobile about the upcoming matchup, everyone was shocked that Francis Ngannou walked away from the UFC, and that too as a champion. Considering how Jon Jones will fight Ciryl Gane for the vacant heavyweight title instead, it sounds rather weird that Dana's still coming for Francis. After all, the deal UFC made with the Cameroonian-French MMA artist wasn't exactly that lucrative. Now, White claims he'd have been the highest paid heavyweight champion in history if he stayed back. And if that's true, Ngannou would have made more than what Lesnar got from the UFC, but since he's turned down Dana's offer, there seems to be a lot of bad blood between the two. White's not exactly Francis's biggest fan right now. Even though Dana's already got the upcoming heavyweight title match sorted, he's still coming after Francis Ngannou. Why? Well, something about not wanting to fight, apparently. Sound familiar? Bingo. That's what he says every time a UFC fighter proposes that they want to be paid more than their current package, which by UFC standards is not a lot. Now, the UFC is not a poor organization. Sure, it's got its fair share of poor money management, but that's kind of an occupational hazard for them at this point. Anyway, back to why Dana's throwing all kinds of shade at Ngannou. Apparently, according to him, Francis is at a place right now where he doesn't want to take any risks. Who would when their career's at stake? But Dana thinks Francis wants to fight lesser opponents and make more money. He also believes that the Predator is not exactly getting any younger either, so maybe that's why he wants to take it easy. Ouch. Those are some pretty hard words, don't you think? Sure, he's just coming out of knee surgery, but that doesn't mean he's lost his career. Maybe Dana wouldn't have said all this if Francis would have just stayed back. But the grass seems to be greener on the other side for him. Speaking of, many UFC fighters have left the ring for more money. White already knows that Francis isn't the first one to leave for a couple extra Ben Franklins. And he certainly won't be the last. After Brock Lesnar's records were made public following the antitrust lawsuit, it's hard to believe that the highest paid guy was barely taking anything home. Like, come on, he's winning you all these amazing bouts and you're giving away only $1.65 million to him as a champion? No wonder the fighters are flocking over to other opportunities. If I'm out there busting my rear, quite literally, then I kind of expect to take home enough to treat myself. Now, I'm not saying these fighters are out there on the street or extreme couponing, but still, isn't it a bit unfair when you compare the numbers to other sports? It's like UFC fighters are the middle child of sports. So for Dana to say that players don't want to fight is kind of ridiculous. But this isn't his first time saying this. Dana's pretty adamant that fighters don't want to fight. Now, just for a second, imagine that you're a UFC fighter and you've been training day in and day out to prove your worth. But then you decide you also want it to be a lucrative gig. So you try looking for other options to win. And when you tell your boss you're not going to fight for them any longer, they sort of completely miss the point and say that UFC fighters don't actually want to fight. But here's where things get interesting. They don't even force you to fight either. Bossman here just lets it be and thinks it's whack players don't want to do what they're supposed to do. If you ask me, it kinda seems like things get lost in translation for Dana White a lot. And oh, they so did. Dana White thought Robert Whittaker didn't want to fight either. So it's not just Francis who somehow became a voodoo doll for White. Whitaker also had to shoulder through White's jabs at him. Well, technically not jabs, things were just heavily miscommunicated here. Or was it intentional? Well, back in 2021, after Robert won against Kelvin Gastelum, he basically told everyone he wanted a rematch with Israel Adesanya. Whitaker said that all that he's really aiming for is the title shot, and the rest is just background noise to him. But seems like Dana missed the memo and thought Whitaker never wanted the rematch, despite Robert saying that he did. White told ESPN that he was adamant about Adesanya fighting Whitaker for the title, but hearing Robert say that he doesn't want to fight him seemed crazy to him, and it's not like things were better the year before either. In 2020, Dana told the media his own version of the truth. So here's the thing. Back when Jon Jones and George Masvidal opened up about the unfair pay structure of the UFC, instead of addressing their concerns and, paying them their worth, guess what Dana said? Yep, the two fighters don't want to fight. It's like if you ask for a raise and you don't get it, you end up walking out. But not before your boss tells other people that you no longer want to work. Kinda whack, isn't it? Now, obviously, White had to justify what he said and elaborated that since there was a whole pandemic going on, he assumed fighters would be worried and even wondered if they no longer wanted to fight. That's also how George and John's protest for better pay sorta got sidelined here. And the blame somehow got shifted to the two of them not wanting to play, and of course, the pandemic. And if you think that was the only time Dana used his famous one-liner, think again. White used his go-to trope again. I swear, if I had to take a shot every time he used that phrase, because at this point it kind of feels like his secret code word. That's really not that much of a secret anymore, because every time Dana opens up about his fighters suddenly not being in the mood for a bout, I think it's safe to assume they brought up the possibility of a raise and were shut down almost immediately. So basically, one of the sticking points of a potential fight between Dustin Poirier and Tony Ferguson was that the former needed a little more incentive to fight. Dana, on the other hand, completely misheard that. Almost like there he was a couple wavelengths out of range. Because while Dustin wanted to be paid more, White heard that the American didn't want to, you guessed it, fight. And sure, while he didn't exactly say anything bad about the pro fighter, he did say that didn't know what Dustin's deal was. Well, Dana, the poor guy needed you guys to pay him a fair sum. And it wasn't like he was turning down the fight either. He just simply wanted a raise. Maybe the UFC should look into increasing budgets if they don't want fighters to leave. That's all for Dana White and his go-to trope. See you in the next video.